Welcome to a Christmas collection of heartfelt hauntings. As the air turns crisp and the world glows with twinkling lights, there's a certain magic to the holiday season, a time when the past feels closer, and the veil between the living and the loved seems thinner. In this collection, I bring you stories that warm the heart and stir the soul, blending the charm of the season with a touch of the otherworldly. These are tales of lingering love, gentle guardians, and spirits that remind us of what truly matters: family, kindness, and connection. So grab a cozy blanket, a cup of something warm, and let the glow of your Christmas tree illuminate these enchanting, bittersweet, and utterly human encounters with the beyond. After all, isn't this the season for a little bit of wonder? It was 17 years ago this March that my paternal grandmother passed away. She had caught a cold and was admitted to the hospital, and within 2 days, she was gone. Nowadays, I live far from my family home. I got married and I have a family, but back then, I shared that house with my parents and my grandma, just the four of us. My grandmother adored me, and I cherished her deeply. She was so full of life and energy that even my aunts and uncles were in shock, repeating, "We never thought she'd pass on so soon." When we held her funeral, I could hardly believe it myself. It just didn't feel real. That summer, the Obon season, when families all across Japan honor their ancestors, relatives gathered at my parents' house to pay respects. It was decided that everyone would visit the grave together. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join them. I was pregnant at the time, and my morning sickness was particularly bad that day. Reluctantly, I stayed behind at the house while everyone else went. It was an unusually hot day for Hokkaido. Seeking relief from the heat, I decided to rest in the cool Butsuma, the room where the family altar was kept. Wrapping myself lightly in a towel blanket, I lay down for a nap. The cicadas droned outside, their song blending with the gentle breeze that floated in through the open window. I must have drifted off, lulled by the serene atmosphere. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but suddenly, a loud crash jolted me awake. The portraits of my grandparents, which hung above the altar, had both fallen at the same time. Startled, I jumped up and hurried to inspect them. Miraculously, the glass in both frames was intact. The cords that held the frames, however, had snapped clean through. I fetched some new cord and a sturdy chair so I could rehang the portraits. As I steadied myself on the chair, ready to lift the first frame, I heard it. "Don't do that." It was my grandma's voice, clear, gentle, and impossibly real. I swear it sounded like she was in the room with me. I froze. "Grandma?" I called out instinctively, my heart racing. At that exact moment, I heard the clamor of footsteps and voices as my family returned from the cemetery. They came into the Butsuma, presumably to check on me, and was startled to see me standing there with one of the frames in my hands. My mother's face turned pale as she cried out, "That chair! It's broken!" She explained that the chair had been damaged some time ago and was unstable. One wrong move and I could have easily fallen. Something especially dangerous considering I was pregnant at the time. I couldn't help but feel that Grandma had saved me. Was she warning me about the chair by saying, "Don't do that"? I wondered. But one mystery lingers in my mind even now. Why did the cords holding both portraits snap at the same time? If they hadn't, I wouldn't have needed to climb that chair at all. It's almost as if some presence other than my grandmother's was there too. Maybe one that had ill intentions. I'm grateful that I heard her voice before I got up on that chair. My dad passed away when I was in the 3rd grade. Losing him was a heartbreak I didn't fully understand at the time. It felt like something essential had been quietly taken from our home. This story happened about 6 months later. One night I stayed up much later than usual, until around 3 a.m. That was rare for me back then. I finally decided to head to bed and make my way upstairs to my room. As I passed by my mum's room, I noticed that her door was left wide open. It was late autumn, and the nights had turned cold. I worried that she might catch a chill, so I went to close it for her. That's when I saw him, standing next to her bed, leaning over as if he was watching her sleep, was my dad. At first, I didn't feel scared or shocked. Oddly enough, I stayed calm. I'd seen strange, unexplainable things before, so the sight didn't shake me. Instead, I found myself wondering, did he come back to see her? I stayed where I was, quietly watching. Dad placed one hand gently on the bed, leaning closer to Mum. I realized what he was doing. He was trying to kiss her. My face flushed with embarrassment. It felt like I was intruding on something deeply personal, but I couldn't look away. Just as he was about to kiss her, Mum shifted in her sleep and rolled on to her side. Dad's lips met the pillow instead. For a moment, he froze there, unmoving. It was such a small, almost silly moment that I couldn't help it. I let out a laugh. He turned to look at me. His expression caught me off guard. It wasn't anger. It was something softer, almost sad. It was as if he hadn't expected anyone to be there, let alone witness that moment. We stared at one another, in silence, for what felt like a long time. Then Mum shifted again, rolling onto her back. Dad's face softened into a smile as if to say, "This is my chance." He turned back to her and this time leaned down to kiss her on the lips. After that, he stepped over to where my older brother was sleeping on the floor, bundled up in a futon. Dad crouched down and gently kissed his forehead. Finally, he came to me. I stood frozen in the doorway as he leaned down and kissed my forehead too. It didn't feel cold or strange, it felt warm, familiar and comforting, like the way he used to tuck me in when I was little. And then, just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do or how to process what had just happened. But I didn't feel scared or sad. Instead, I felt loved. That night, it felt like Dad had come back, just for a little while, to remind us that he was still here, still watching over us, and still loving us in his own quiet way. This story takes me back several years to a time when I was just starting out in my career. I was a few years into the workforce, still finding my footing, when I was assigned to an incredibly demanding department at the ward office in Sapporo City, Hokkaido. The work was relentless. Pulling late nights was a given. Staying until 10 p.m. or later had become part of my daily routine. That April, we got a new section chief, basically a new boss. He was a small, elderly man with snow-white, bushy eyebrows that were so distinctive, they stood out instantly. They reminded me of Bowser from the Mario games, thick, expressive, and slightly comical in a charming way. That's how I first saw him, a kind and slightly quirky man who seemed very different from the usual stern and distant senior managers. Most of the section chiefs and department heads didn't bother sticking around late. Since they weren't eligible for overtime pay, they'd promptly leave at 5 p.m., leaving us junior staff to fend for ourselves, buried in mountains of unfinished work. It was just the way things were, but this new chief broke that mold entirely. He didn't pack up and leave the moment the clock struck 5. Instead, he often stayed until it was about 8 p.m., sometimes even later, offering us guidance and lending a hand wherever he could. I still remember the shock I felt when I realized what he was doing. He doesn't even get paid for this. Why is he staying so late? It was baffling, but also deeply inspiring. He had a warmth about him that was impossible to ignore. Despite being in a senior position, he treated everyone with kindness and respect. There was no arrogance, no superiority, just genuine care for all the people around him. I remember how he'd pause on his way out each evening to call back to us with a gentle reminder. Don't stay too late. Don't overdo it, alright? I'm heading off now, take care. It wasn't just words either, he meant it. You could see it in the way he looked out for us, in the time he took to listen to our concerns. His presence made the grueling workload just a little bit more bearable. I'd later learned that he'd been a department head before taking this role, which only made his humility even more remarkable. He took a step down to support us. He had every reason to act aloof, to distance himself from the day-to-day grind, but instead he chose to roll up his sleeves and be there for us. Then in August of that year, tragedy struck. The chief passed away unexpectedly. One evening after returning home, he suffered a subarachnoid hemorrhage. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The news was devastating. It felt impossible to process. He'd been with us just the day before, full of life and energy, giving his usual parting words as he left for the evening. Take care, don't push yourselves too hard. Looking back, I'd realized he'd left on time that day, something he almost never did. Perhaps he hadn't been feeling well, but none of us could have known. The day after his passing, the office was quieter than usual. Grief hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. At one point, a colleague muttered something that stayed with me ever since. The good ones always go too soon. That evening, like so many before it, I found myself working late again. The office was mostly empty, only with a handful of us still at our desks. It was midsummer, and the heat was oppressive. The windows were sealed tight to keep out the bugs, and the air conditioning was running full blast. Around 8 p.m., something strange happened. A butterfly appeared. It fluttered softly into the room, its delicate wings catching the light as it moved from desk to desk. It wasn't frantic or aimless. Instead, it seemed purposeful, as if it were inspecting each workplace, one by one. It didn't make sense. The windows were closed, and there was no way for it to have gotten in. Yet, there it was. I froze. Somehow, deep in my heart, I knew. That butterfly wasn't just a butterfly. It was him. Normally, I'm terrified of insects. Even a fly buzzing near me is enough to make me jump out of my seat, but this butterfly didn't evoke fear or disgust. Instead, it brought an overwhelming sense of calm. Watching it glide gracefully through the room, I felt a strange but undeniable comfort, as though I were in the presence of something familiar and kind. It hovered over each desk, taking its time before completing its circuit. Then, without hesitation, it made its way out the door, the same door the chief always used when leaving for the night. And just like that, it was gone. I sat there staring at an empty doorway, unable to move. It was exactly 8 p.m., the time he usually left. The time he used to pause, look back at us, and remind us not to work too hard. It was as though he came back one last time, making his rounds to check in on us, just like he always did. Tears welled up in my eyes as that realization sank in. Even in death, he had found a way to let us know he still cared. I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural or the unexplainable. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories and the like. But that night something changed. Logic just didn't seem to matter anymore. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that that butterfly was him. I still think about it sometimes. how unfair it was that he had to leave us so soon. He was barely in his 60s. He had so much more to give. But in that quiet, fleeting moment, he showed us that even after death, the bonds we shared don't just disappear. They linger, like a gentle reminder that the ones we've lost are never truly gone. When I was born, my parents bought me a stuffed animal. It wasn't just a toy, it became my constant companion. Every single night I slept with it tucked under my arm. If you flip through my childhood photo albums, you'll see it in almost every picture. Whether I was playing in the living room or out on a family trip, that stuffed animal was always by my side. Even when I got older, into my teens and even in high school. Its worn-out seams and fading fabric didn't bother me. I'd stitch it back together when needed, determined to keep it close. When I got married and moved into my husband's house, of course, it came with me. It was non-negotiable. But my husband, he didn't quite share the sentiment. He'd glance at it with disdain and say things like, "It's dirty. Why do you have that? Just throw it away already." I could see where he was coming from. Objectively, it was old and tattered, but to me, it was irreplaceable, so I kept it on my side of the bed, out of his way. Then one day it disappeared. I searched everywhere, but it was gone. Deep down, I was pretty sure that my husband had thrown it out. When I confronted him, he swore up and down, "I didn't touch it." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was behind it. Years passed, we built a new home, and moved in. Life went on, but I never forgot about that stuffed animal. Then, about a year after we'd settled into our new place, my mum showed up with a surprise. She said, "I was cleaning out your old room at the house, and look what I found in the back of your closet." It was my stuffed animal. I couldn't believe it. How on earth had it ended up there? I hadn't left anything important at my parents' house when I moved out. I hadn't touched that closet in years, yet there it was, safe, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I didn't question it too much. I was so thrilled to have it back. That night I brought it upstairs and tucked it into bed with me, just like old times. As for my husband, he hasn't said a word about it. Now that we have a child, I've started to tell him about this little stuffed friend of mine. I've said, "This is Mummy's special friend. If anything ever happens to me, you have to promise to let me be buried with it." I know that might sound strange or maybe even morbid to some people, but that stuffed animal has been with me through so much, every milestone, every tear, every laugh. It's more than fabric and stuffing, I know it is. It's part of me. And now, as it rests again on my pillow, I feel like everything has come full circle. My best friend has always had a knack for seeing things, ghostly things to be exact. One day he stopped by my workplace. As we passed by the stairwell, he glanced at it and casually said, "People trip there a lot, don't they?" I was stunned. He was right. It's practically a rite of passage at work. Everyone sooner or later takes a tumble on that particular set of stairs. We'd always joked about it in the office. "It's gotta be haunted," someone would say. Another would chime in with, "I bet there's a ghost girl from one of those horror shows lurking around." Once we even half seriously debated calling in a monk to purify the place. So naturally I couldn't resist asking my friend, "Alright, what's really going on with those stairs? Is there something there?" He paused for a moment, looking thoughtfully before he answered. "A Shiba Inu," he said matter-of-factly. "It's lying down, wagging its tail. just watching everyone go by. A dog? A cheerful little dog? Not some ghostly spectre, not some vengeful spirit, but a Shiba Inu. After that, everything changed. Someone suggested we leave a dog toy, a little ball near the stairs. It felt silly at first, but we figured why not. It was good conversation for the office at least. And then something odd happened. Every now and then that ball would mysteriously roll over to one of us. No one knew how, but it always seemed to pick someone nearby. When it did, we'd pick it up and toss it back towards the stairs. It became a bit of a ritual. Whenever we used the stairs, we'd say things like, "Excuse me, just passing through," and wouldn't you know it, the tripping all but stopped. It was as though the dog, whatever or whoever it had been, just wanted a little acknowledgement, maybe even a little bit of playtime. As time went on, we couldn't help but wonder, whose dog was it? The mystery was solved when a colleague mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she'd had a Shiba Inu years ago. The dog had passed away not long after she started working here. And it all made sense. She was the only one in the office who had ever owned a Shiba Inu. And wouldn't you know it, the ball had a habit of rolling over to her more than anyone else. We don't have any plans to bring in a monk or hold any ceremonies to send the dog away. Not yet, anyway. But one day, when the time feels right, I hope that happy little Shiba Inu will find its way to wherever it's meant to be. Until then, we'll keep playing fetch, leaving the ball near the stairs, and saying a friendly, "Just passing through." For now, it's nice knowing it's there, wagging its tail, and keeping an eye on us. For years, I only drove used cars, hand-me-downs that had seen better days, but 7 years ago, I finally did it. I bought my very first new car, a Volvo. I'll never forget the excitement as I waited for it to arrive. I was so thrilled that, for some reason, I made a bold promise to my grandma. When it gets here, you're going to be the first person I take for a ride, even before my wife. The day finally came, and I kept my word. As soon as the car was in my hands, I picked her up, and we drove around the neighborhood. We went through tunnels, winding roads, and familiar streets. She was delighted, grinning ear to ear the whole time. "It feels so smooth. This is fancy, really high class," she said, patting the seat as if to show her approval. Over the years, I had the privilege of looking after her, especially during her later days. Even as her health declined, she would often reminisce about that first ride in the Volvo. "That made me so happy," she'd tell me, her voice full of warmth. Her last days came too soon. A couple of years ago, when she called for help in distress, I rushed over as quickly as I could. Despite the pain she was in, she managed a faint smile and said, "That car of yours, so quick. You came so fast. I was surprised." And then she was gone. Since then, when life weighs heavy on me, I find myself retreating to the car. I'll sit in the driver's seat, glance at the empty passenger side, and speak as though she's there. I pour my heart out, sometimes shouting, sometimes whispering, like I'm having a conversation with her. Every now and then, something strange happens. The car fills with a familiar scent, subtle but unmistakable. It's the comforting smell of her, a mix of that distinctive elderly warmth and the musty old home scent from her house. It's not just a faint memory, I swear I can really smell it. It's like she's still there, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, listening to me. I've thought about it often. If she's still around in some way, then why not let me hear her voice again? I'd give anything to hear her laugh, or even a simple, "Don't worry, it's all gonna work out." But for now, I'll just settle for the scent, the memories, and the way it feels like she's still riding along with me. You know, I should probably upgrade and get a new car, but I think I'll hold off for now. About 6 months ago, something happened that shook my family. My mum collapsed at work. Thankfully, she regained consciousness quickly, and her colleagues immediately called for an ambulance, and it took her to the nearest emergency hospital. When I got the call, I rushed over as fast as I could. But by the time I arrived, Mum was already in the middle of tests, and Dad was already there. While we waited, Dad realized he'd forgotten to lock up the house. He rushed out the door so fast he wasn't focused, so I offered to go back to our family home to check on things. We've always had cats, several of them in fact, and one of them, a cat I rescued back when I was in college, had been sick recently. I'd heard from my parents that the cat had started to perk up a few days ago, so I wasn't too worried. When I got home, that cat seemed full of energy. She greeted me like she always did, rubbing against my legs and purring. I knelt down, gave her head a good scratch, and put out some food for her before getting ready to leave for the hospital again. Just as I was about to head out, I got a call. It was the hospital. They told me that Mum had suffered an acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and her condition was too serious for them to handle. They were transferring her by ambulance to a larger hospital for emergency surgery. Panic set in, but I made it to the new hospital as quickly as I could. When I arrived, Mum was already in surgery. Before they took her in, the doctors had told my dad how dire the situation was. The blockage was in one of the worst possible spots. They had warned him that there was a chance she might not make it. The surgery lasted about 4 hours. When it was over, Mum was moved to the ICU. While she recovered, I went back to the house to gather some things that she'd need for her hospital stay. When I walked into the living room, I froze. There, in Mum's usual spot on the couch, was my cat, the one I'd seen so lively a few hours ago. But now, she was completely still, cold, and lifeless. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace for some reason, as if someone had directly whispered into my mind, "Mum's gonna be okay." And she was. Mum pulled through and made a full recovery. These days, she's as lively as ever, and we're so grateful that she's still with us. But I can't help but believe that my cat had something to do with it. That maybe in her own way she took on the burden meant for my mum. Looking back, I regret not taking the time to open one of her favorite canned foods that day. I was in such a rush to get back to the hospital that I missed my chance to spoil her one last time. It's been 6 months now, and I still think about her often. Sometimes I can't help but cry when I remember her. To my sweet little girl, please don't forget me. One day, when it's my time, I hope we'll meet again.